Right. Good evening, everyone. We'll just wait a few moments for all participants to enter the webinar, and then we'll get started shortly. All right. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar, virtual open house for the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan at the City of Langley. It's an exciting time to host this event with the draft neighborhood plan ready and completed. And now we are here tonight to really solicit a little bit of feedback from you folks and also to present to you the finer details of the plan. My name is Patrick Oistreck. Some of you might have actually joined us last night and you might have seen our presentation on the draft official community plan. We're going to follow a very similar template, but for those of you who weren't there last night, like I said, my name is Patrick Oistreck and I'm a senior planner with Modus Planning, Design and Engagement. And I'm going to, and me and the team that you have in front of you here on video will be helping us get through the evening here with a presentation and a bit of a Q&A session at the end where we'll be able to answer some of your questions. But before we get into that, I want to first of all acknowledge that while we're gathering here tonight online, that the lands that are related to this Nicomekl River District neighborhood plan are on the unceded territories of the Kwantlen, Katsi, Semiahmoo, and Matsqui First Nations. And as a team, we're very honored to have the opportunity to plan for the future of these lands through this really important and significant neighborhood plan process. So with that, I also want to note that you are currently muted and your video is not on, and that is a function of the webinar platform with Zoom. We have approximately over 50 attendees, and maybe more coming in as we progress through the session. So we want to make sure that we can get through the presentation and then do a Q&A session with everyone and answer as many questions as possible. So that's how it's going to be maintained over the course of this webinar. One thing to note as well is that the session will be recorded. And so we will be posting this webinar online so that folks who haven't got the chance to see the full video, or folks who didn't have the chance to come tonight at all, will have the opportunity to review it at a later date on the langleycity.ca website. So there's not only me behind this project, obviously, we have a whole team of people, of folks, of experts who've worked on this project. And even those who are in front of you at this web panel here doesn't show the extent of that project team, but I'm going to introduce the ones here tonight. First, we have Edward Porter, who's principal and co-owner of Modus Planning, Design and Engagement. We also have Jean Rowe, also a planner at Modus Planning, Design, Engagement, and Jessica Mann, planner who's been with us along this entire project as well with Modus. And then from the City of Langley, we have Francis Chung, Chief Administrative Officer. We have Carl Johansson, who is the Director of Development Services. We have Roy Bedo, Deputy Director of Development Services. And we have Anton Metalnikov, who's a planning assistant here at the City of Langley as well. All right, so with that said, I'm going to pass the baton over to Francis, our CAO, for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Patrick. And on behalf of City Council and our staff and the Modus team, I want to welcome the new participants who are joining us tonight for the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan. And we want to welcome back to those participants who attended last night's OCP virtual open house and spending the second night with us. As I said last night, It has certainly been a strange and challenging year. And who would have thought that we'd be holding a virtual open house instead of meeting you in person when we started the process back in 2019. The journey to get to where we are tonight actually started back in 2008 when City Council adopted a new strategic vision, Langley City, Nexus of Community, to guide growth in Langley City over the next 25 years. As some of you are aware, Langley City has often been described as the hub of the Fraser Valley, not only geographically, but also economically. And from a historical perspective and into the future, we are the central point and a vital link between Metro Vancouver and Fraser Valley. And our nexus of community vision builds on this regional context that by the year 2050, the population of Surrey, Langley City, and Langley Township is projected to increase by another 428,000 people and additional 147,000 new jobs. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to capitalize on the SkyTrain extension to Langley City within the next 8 to 10 years. We want to build on our strategic location, strong population growth, and being a regional growth magnet. We want to leverage the SkyTrain investment as a catalyst for sustainable, transit-oriented development. The Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan is a companion document to the OCP. The Nicomekl Plan, however, is much more than land use policies. The plan is a recognition and celebration of the significance of the Nicomekl River, which flows through the center of Langley City, and is truly the jewel of the city. It is an important natural asset with significant ecological habitats for salmon and other fish species. The Nicomekl River serves as the green lungs of the community. It's a place to escape the fast-paced and buzzing activity of the city, to find peace and quiet, and to enjoy the nature. Homes now line the edges of the floodplain in the form of apartment blocks, townhouses, and single detached dwellings. Trails weave through the park space, providing access to the natural setting, and encouraging residents to walk or bike through the neighborhood. The Nicomekl Plan is intended to provide a seam and unite the north and the south sides of the city. It will shape new growth in a way that provides a broader range of missing middle housing options and create an attractive neighborhood that is anchored by rich ecological features of the Nicomekl River floodplain. Our team tonight will show you how these can be achieved in the Nicomekl River Plan. We have undertaken an extensive consultation process over the past 12 months in the development of the draft Nicomekl Plan. Tonight is another opportunity for the city to receive input from the public and stakeholders on the plan. We do want to encourage you to provide your comments to us after the presentation by Modus tonight on the proposed policy, key themes, and land use plans under the draft Nicomekl Plan. Based on your feedback, we will formulate the recommendations to City Council, which may include potential changes to the draft plans or further analysis, and which will be done prior to these plans being considered for adoption by City Council. Again, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And with that, I will pass it back on to Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I'm just going to share my screen here. I think, Jean, I'm going to need to be made co-host to share my screen. So 1 second here. Great. So we're going to go through a presentation for everyone. And the first thing that we want to notify you, for some of you who might not be familiar with the Zoom webinar platform, is the functionality that you might be seeing on your screen today. So you have 3 buttons near the bottom of your screen. The button on the left is the chat button. So if you click that, you'll see the chat box open up. That chat box can be used to send messages to us, the panelists, and we'll be recording those messages as input into the process and as feedback and for the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan. You can also communicate your technical issues if you're having any problems, accessing any of the features on Zoom. feel free to send a message, and Jean, our tech moderator tonight, will endeavor to answer the questions and fix as many problems as she can if they arise. The second function, the second button, is the lower hand button, or the raise hand button as well. So that button will not be super useful this evening. Given we have such high numbers of participants, we won't be able to address any specific issues that you have unless you bring it into the chat. So we would just encourage you to bring any kind of issues into the chat, and we'll try and address it there. And then finally, the button for the Q&A. And so this button will help us at the end of the presentation to help us clarify any kind of questions and answer your questions for whatever you may have around the content of the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan and its process. Once you click on the chat button, what you'll notice is that little chat box opens up. This is where in that bottom right hand corner where you can enter in any text, and this text can be seen only by us, the panelists. So please, if you have any input, any feedback, that's where you can leave it for us. And if you push the Q&A button, you'll see this box open up. And we would gently encourage everyone to refrain from asking any questions through the Q&A platform until after the presentation, because it's very likely that we will be able to answer some of the questions through our presentation for you. But once we do encourage you, though, to think about questions as we are going through the presentation. Maybe write them down, jot them down on a piece of paper, and then when we're ready for the Q&A, we would then hope to see some of those questions, and we'll endeavor to answer as many questions as we can tonight, given the time that we have. And so, yeah, the other feature, actually, a part of this Q&A platform is once you ask a question and other attendees ask questions, you can also select the little thumbs up button that is under a question if you wish to upvote one of the questions that has already been asked. This is a feature that will essentially bump up some of the questions to the top of the list. And it tells us that the attendees here tonight would really love to hear an answer to that question. So if you see something and you don't feel like repeating that same question, you would just like to ensure that somebody else's question gets answered and it's fairly similar to the question you were about to ask, we would also encourage you to just upvote that question. All right. To start us off tonight, what I'd love to do is an activity around a question, which will hopefully get the creative juices flowing a little bit and get us thinking about what we love most about the Nicomekl River. And so what I'd like for everyone to do is go into your chat box and enter in what it is that you love most about the Nicomekl River. And wait about 30 seconds before you press enter. And then when I say go, press enter, and we'll start reading out some of the items in there. And I think that'll be a really great exercise to see just how special this important natural asset at the heart of Langley City is for everyone. So we'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. And in a few moments, I'll ask you to press enter. All right, thank you, everyone. So please press enter. All right, so I'm seeing the trails, the sunsets over the water, the ease of access, the well-maintained and a park and the natural aesthetics, quiet oasis away from the city, the green space, the bike path and the walking paths, wildlife refuge. It's peaceful, quiet natural habitat in the middle of the city, the natural environment, the great accessible walking trails, biodiversity. These are all really fantastic. Somebody even is saying yesterday they saw 3 deer near Fraser Highway. So it really is a special environment for the natural wildlife and for Langley City residents to really connect with that nature. So that's really great to see that everybody is also feeling very similarly about that. I'm going to pass it on now to Edward Porter, our principal, to go over the agenda and the purpose of this meeting, and also talk a little bit about the project overview here.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Great to see these ideas, as they really are central to the whole purpose of the neighborhood plan itself, the river being the center of the plan. So just very quickly wanted to cover over the agenda for the time that we have this evening. I'm going to speak very quickly but explicitly to the purpose of the evening. We're going to provide a little bit of I will provide a little bit of a project overview in terms of the timeline and the steps we've taken to get to where we are tonight in presenting then step 3 here, the draft Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan. So really the meat of the presentation this evening will be in presenting the draft plan itself and that content and providing that review. We'll move then into the Q&A period and spend about an hour with a Q&A session and speak to clarifying next steps as well. So in speaking to the purpose of this evening's session, this again, just trying to make this very clear, we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to learn more about the draft neighborhood plan. And that will largely come through the presentation that I'll pass over for Patrick to take on next. And then in that next point of purpose that we can provide clarification about the policies and content that are presented this evening through that more in-depth Q&A with the panel. And again, we'll open that up to the panelists that are all joining from the MODIS team, but as well the city's team. And then also, of course, to receive feedback and comments on the draft as we present this evening. In clarifying our next steps, that feedback and those comments will be considered in advance of presenting a final draft to council for consideration, looking at sort of the timeline to March and April, and we'll speak more and clarify those timelines later this evening. So to take a moment to speak to the overall project overview, we take a big step back and review the initial project scope. And here we have sort of 4 points that I think we can say aren't necessarily in order of priority or importance necessarily. These are all sort of component parts of what we understand this neighborhood plan needs to do and the purpose of undertaking a neighborhood planning process. We also recognize, and I think Francis actually spoke to this very eloquently, in the opportunity that we have in considering a neighborhood plan that is largely driven by and defined by a river and the system of the river and the floodplain and the relationship of these neighborhoods and the city fabric to this big open space. It is really unique. And in that sense, you know, again, I think this is why we've really enjoyed the project and where we see the real opportunities here in developing the neighborhood plan. But to speak specifically to these points, the neighborhood plan contains a land use strategy that starts to look a little bit more closely than what you would see at the typical official community plan scale. And we start to look at the way the river behaves and the physical qualities of that river, and then how it sits adjacent to the city lands and neighborhoods on either side. So really looking as again, I think Francis used a very nice word, I think, in saying that it would weave or create a seam within the city and bringing the different sides, other sides of the river together in the use of that space. The second point there is that these are largely understood as, you know, places where people live. So this idea that we consider residential precincts, or as Patrick will get into presenting the plan, these ideas of landscape rooms. So how we organize around these features largely driven by the qualities of the floodplain itself and the Nicomekl River and those spaces, but thinking about that in its relationship to neighborhoods and people living in those places, how those open spaces are really these central amenities to those neighborhoods. And then even getting into certain cases, and we'll get into this in the plan, where the parks and greenways and outdoor recreation certainly forms a very large part of that, but where we also understood that there might be an opportunity to consider additional amenities within different distinct portions of the neighborhood plan in light of their location, be it further away from the city center or adjacent other points of transportation or places where people may choose to gather more regularly. So that we'll start to see, but largely driven by how do we understand residential precincts and its relationship to the river. The third point around watercourse and environmental protection generally, but also obviously very specific to the health of the Nicomekl River. A lot of what we'll see within the plan itself is thinking about those riparian values and how that starts to inform design thinking or programming or activities that we see within the plan area. And then a lot of those protection measures in a more general sense then start to float up to the level of the official community plan and some of those environmental development permit area guidelines that would be held within that overarching document. So there are some cases in the neighborhood plan where things are understood as so fundamental or so central to basic environmental protection that the neighborhood plan actually elevates that to the level of the official community plan. And finally, to speak to some more of that policy and the mechanics of what the neighborhood plan would hold, the last point there that we do get into specific guidelines and implementation policies, again, around perhaps form and character or other specifics within the neighborhood plan that, again, are better defined or refined at this scale of the neighborhood and as distinct from the official community plan, which would contain some of this information as well. So in terms of the process to date and where we've been, amazingly, we began this process pre-COVID in our kickoff. And so the project launch, and as we sort of started to build a head of steam and frame the real sort of fundamental direction of the project through the design charrette, we were all gathered together in I think the way we've typically enjoyed working on projects as interesting, as complex as this, all together around big sheets of paper and maps and sticky notes and a real gathering of energetic participants. That was our phase one, and we're grateful that we were able to move through that space to explore options and then bring that together and present in an open house format and get a lot of great feedback on that. In phase two, we then took a lot of those directional ideas and the options that were developed, started to refine those towards a preferred concept, refining a draft vision and principles and considerations for future conditions. Again, a lot of those, the concepts and policies developed at that stage were presented at the open house and receiving feedback through that, as well as a series of working sessions like local stakeholder groups and different public events at that stage to receive further feedback. From there, we've then refined the draft plan that we are presenting this evening. So here we have our virtual session. And again, speaking to the purpose of the evening will be to present that, to receive feedback, and ultimately we will be refining the plan ahead of council consideration as a next step. So thanks again for being here and being a part of this. I believe this is where I hand it back to Patrick. Oh no, there's one more slide here just to speak to then the relationship of the official community plan to these neighborhood plans, or in this case, a couple of appendices with the Nicomekl River District neighborhood plan and then the district policies as a separate, almost towards an implementation strategy and policies towards these more specific areas. Spoke to this a little bit before in terms of where content within the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan references other pieces within the official community plan. But this will certainly get into a next layer down of specificity and direction around future development within these lands that we see as so influenced by and characterized by their relationship to the river. So with that, I will hand this over to Patrick, who will walk us through and present the draft neighborhood plan. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Edward. So to start us off, we have at the start of any kind of big plan, whether it's an official community plan or a neighborhood plan, is a vision statement. And so in the neighborhood plan for the Nicomekl River District, we speak of a complete neighborhood rich with attractive and diverse experiences and features. Its focal point and the thread that sews the neighborhood together is the dynamic Nicomekl River. It's visible, accessible, and captivating. Langley residents treasure its increasing ecological, educational, and social value. Visitors journey far and wide to discover the neighborhood, revel in its natural beauty, and take part in the charming public life that distinguishes this vibrant destination. And so that vision statement is really the foundational component of this neighborhood plan, and all the other policies try to bring to life that vision. One aspect of how we bring that vision to life and how we start speaking about some of these residential precincts, as was noted by Edward, is this concept of 4 separate rooms. And so this is a direct result from the design charrette that we held, where we felt that there was this really great sort of strategy to divide the corridor into 4 separate rooms, each with its own unique identity and each with its own sort of special character. And so the furthest to the east would, and sort of acting as the gateway into all subsequent rooms, is the front porch. It's bound by the 208 to the east, and it would be really characterized as sort of that friendly face and that welcoming gateway into the neighborhood. Within the front porch, some key features are sort of the redesign of the intersection of Fraser Highway and 208 to make it more pedestrian friendly and really entice and make it an inviting environment, especially for example, the seniors who may be living in the old Yale Seniors Complex, and other residents who are living just north of that area, really drawing them in and giving them that special experience as they enter into this floodplain. The second room is the living room. And so this room is much like it would be in a regular house. It's a place of gathering. It's a place of greater activity. And so this is a room that's bound by 208 Street, or I should say, I believe 51st Avenue and 208, all the way to 203rd. And this room here is, again, all about gathering. We have some special cultural pavilions in this room. So there's the Michaud House, and also what's being proposed in the neighborhood plan is a new mixed-use village, Portage Park, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail over the next few slides here about what that means. But really, it's a new and exciting sort of component of the neighborhood where people would be able to get, sit down at a cafe or find a few small sort of commercial services here and there, and perhaps grab a coffee on a patio while children and family members sort of play it in the park next door to Portage Park. The next room over from the living room is the sunroom. And so the sunroom is really, much like the name says, it's more of a passive space. It's a place of sort of quiet contemplation. It's a place of reflection. There's not a whole lot of programmatic elements in this space. It really is about just reconnecting with the environment of the sunroom. And really kind of creating that link between the Nicomekl Elementary School, which is just north of there, and the Sendell Gardens, just south of the sunroom. And finally, the last room, all the way to the west, I should say, is the Garden Wild room. And so this one is all about reconnecting with nature and with that ecological richness that exists within the floodplain. So in the Garden Wild, we're looking at different kinds of features that would really help with education around that ecological richness, around biodiversity, around wildlife and habitat. There's also an opportunity with the Garden Wild to look at a few ecological restoration projects. And so this is really one of those spaces that has sort of that special component within a house where we can kind of go and learn a little bit more about the environment and that richness in that natural asset of the Nicomekl River. Across all 4 rooms, we've developed policies that speak to these 5 big themes. So the first is a walkable and accessible neighborhood. Then we have a mix of uses. So really thinking about a complete neighborhood that people can live within and do most of their daily activities within that neighborhood. Then we have an ecologically sensitive neighborhood. So recognizing the importance and the significance of this natural asset to the entire city and to the entire watershed as well, with our neighbors in Surrey and the township. We also have a principle or a chapter of policies on a heritage conscious neighborhood. So understanding that the Nicomekl River has a long and rich history, first with indigenous populations who used it for its natural bounty and as a transportation corridor as well. And then second, as European settlers arrived and started to navigate the waters as well through the Nicomekl River, and also agricultural practices that once existed there prior to the city of Langley then also emerging, and then these neighborhoods, these residential neighborhoods coming to life on either side of the floodplain. So understanding that there's a rich history here, and we also want to celebrate that. And finally, a policy chapter on it being a playful and safe neighborhood. And so understanding that there's opportunities to bring a little bit of whimsy and a little bit of fun into this neighborhood for children to feel like they can interact with nature, and also to ensure that there's safety and people feel comfortable walking through these through the trails and through this park system to ensure that people are using it to its full potential. So I'm going to go through some of the features in each one of these policy chapters. So again, with this walkable and accessible neighborhood, we're exploring these ideas of an all-season path on the northern edge of the floodplain, essentially connecting the Bryden Lagoon all the way to 207th Avenue. And this all-season path would be really completed as redevelopment occurs on that northern edge. And so looking at opportunities to gain that strip of right-of-way as new development happens, and to ensure that there's a path that's walkable, that can be cycled on and is fairly direct, and also gets all sorts of types of users to across that that corridor in a way that isn't impeded by flooding. And so ideally, this all-season path would be located in an area that's high enough that it's not impacted by flooding, and would be of a material that would also help or support, cycling and those types of modes of transportation. Another key feature is this new path on the southern part of the floodplain connecting High Knoll Park and 200th Street. And with that, a new pedestrian and cycling bridge connecting the Rotary Floodplain Trail just to the north near Bryden Lagoon over to that new path on that southern edge. And this is a really powerful connection for trails, and I've heard it at the open house just under a year ago. I had a really great conversation with a fellow who was in an electric wheelchair, and he had a really great story about how this would really help him reconnect with nature because of the way in which he would be able to now travel through some of these areas, and you know, suggesting that some of the materials make sure that, you know, that it's accessible for people, because ultimately we know that, you know, nature isn't always as accessible to all folks. And so he was very excited about this, and I think it was a powerful reminder for myself of that need sometimes to ensure that, you know, all types of people and all diversity within our communities should have access to nature. And finally, improve trailheads at all road endings and major road crossings. So this is really a reflection of ensuring that this is an inviting and welcoming space. So thinking about ways of including wayfinding signage, maybe a little bit of lighting at the trailhead entrances, just to ensure that, you know, it feels comfortable, that it's safe, that people can see how long of a distance some of the trails are, they can see where they are along the trail system, and really creating that comfort for folks who are, you know, going on a little bit of an adventure, a journey through the trail system. The second policy chapter is around a complete neighborhood. So some of the features here really relate to that land use component. And so we're talking, you heard Francis speak a little bit about missing middle housing types. And so those housing types are really the types of housing that we find between a single detached home, a very traditional form of housing, and an apartment building. So between those two types of forms, which are really the dominant forms of housing in Langley City today, there are a range, a big diversity of different types of homes. They include things like garden suites. They include things like duplexes, triplexes, and townhouses, and all sorts of really interesting and quite and diverse housing forms. And that helps with affordability. It helps with folks who can't necessarily afford a full single detached home, but might be interested in certainly living close to nature. And also it helps as a mortgage helper as well in certain cases. So for things like secondary suites and garden suites. So there's a whole range of benefits that these missing middle housing types can actually contribute to a neighborhood. And you'll see that through the land use features that we'll present a little bit later. Another key component of creating this complete neighborhood is a few neighborhood village nodes. And so I talked a little bit about this mixed use village at Portage Park, so just adjacent to the park, really kind of transforming a big block of current apartment complexes into what would then become a really dynamic and vibrant mixed-use village, essentially creating a little bit of a village node where people can, again, gather together close to the park and have a coffee, go to a restaurant, and really kind of enjoy their afternoon within that kind of beautiful, serene setting. There's also a mixed use sort of convenience corner development at 200th Street and 50th Avenue. And so that's something that we talked a little bit about yesterday night during the OCP virtual open house. But essentially a small scale, very perhaps 2 or 3 commercial retail units, really pedestrian oriented and very small in scale, so that, you know, we're not creating a strip mall, we're not creating a big commercial development in this area. It's really about focusing on small sort of scale neighborhood needs. So again, maybe you're going there just to pick up a jug of milk or grabbing a coffee, something relatively small scale, and we'll show some pictures of what that might look like. And finally, a commercial food and beverage use at 207th Street and 53rd Avenue. Today, there's a city-owned property where the Langley Community Services facility exists there. And there's a really great opportunity there to also sort of develop a small little restaurant or cafe right up against adjacent to the floodplain. So people can sit on a patio and overlook that beautiful environment. And so creating those mix of uses really helps to complete the neighborhood. There's also a great diversity of open spaces and programs that we're looking at for this neighborhood plan. So, we talked a little bit about the 4 different rooms and the different qualities of character and identity that might inform the types of programs that would be involved in those different rooms. So, for example, in the garden wild room, we would be talking more about wildlife interpretation and ecological restoration. In other rooms, so like the living room, we might be looking at greater options of learning about the history. So there's cultural pavilions and maybe public art and those types of interventions. So really thinking about how each room has a different character and will have different types of programmatic elements to really enhance that special character. And finally, this policy chapter also speaks to a really important feature, which is developing some direction around community amenity contributions to help pay for some of these enhancement projects. And what that means is ensuring that the development that occurs in the neighborhood, so through some of the redevelopment, is actually contributing to the enhancements. So it's not just coming out of capital projects or capital funding. It's not coming directly from taxpayer funding, but it's actually being funded by development that's occurring within the neighborhood. And so that's a really important piece of this neighborhood plan. The third chapter, again, a very important one around an ecologically sensitive neighborhood. And so this one really emphasizes soft engineering strategies. So we understand that there's this really great natural asset here, and we want to make sure that we're using strategies that will enhance that natural asset. The word Nicomekl itself means always flooding in Halkamelem. And we want to make sure that that natural sort of asset is functioning the way it should, which is that flooding is a very natural thing. And so we're looking at strategies like permeable pavement, like daylighting some watercourses that might flow into the Nicomekl River, looking at things like natural flood control and mitigation measures rather than looking at hard edges or hard engineering sort of solutions. So understanding that this is a natural environment. If we're doing any kind of ecological restoration, we also want natural solutions. Then in terms of ecological restoration, a watercourse assessment revealed that everything sort of west of 203rd, there is a lack of trees and shrubs and some tall plants to really help shade the river and protect some of the salmon habitat that exists there and other types of fish, really. And so the ecological restoration strategy really focuses in on trying to include a little bit more trees, a little bit more shrubs, and shading the river so that that fish habitat can really be enhanced in that part of the watercourse. In other parts and across the floodplain, there is also quite a bit of vegetation that are remnants of agricultural practices from before there were residential neighborhoods. And so there's also some language and some policies that speaks to the restoration of native plants and native vegetation in those areas. We also want to make sure that we're containing and managing the Himalayan blackberry bushes because they are an invasive species. But we also heard at the open house that people really love the blackberries, that they really enjoy picking them and having a little snack from time to time. So we're not talking about fully eliminating them. We really just want to make sure that they're not taking over. So it's really about containing and managing those bushes. And finally, a big component of ensuring that this is an ecologically sensitive neighborhood is ensuring that there's natural science and wildlife interpretation, because we know that when people are educated and informed about what's happening in this floodplain, they'll want to protect it even more. And so that's really important to this neighborhood plan, is ensuring that we're providing as much information about those natural processes. In the fourth chapter, we have a heritage conscious neighborhood. And here it really is focused on celebrating and enhancing the Michaud House, which is already a really great cultural icon along the floodplain. And the Portage Park mixed-use village just adjacent to the Michaud House has some policies and some guidelines that speak to really kind of wanting to enhance the landscaping around the Michaud House and really kind of highlight it and create spaces that value this really important piece of Langley City's history. We also speak to things like cultural pavilions that help tell the story of the Nicomekl River and Langley City from various different perspectives, from recent immigrants to First Nations and the settler perspective as well. So we really want to ensure that there's a diverse range of opportunities to tell those really important stories about Langley City's history. And finally, thinking about the different types of partnerships that will really help solidify and create success in the implementation of this plan. So partnerships with local First Nations, with the Kwantlen Polytechnic University, the Langley Heritage Society, Langley Arts Council, several environmental groups like the Langley Environmental Partners Society and the Nicomekl River Enhancement Society as well. So these are really important. We have to engage with these groups if we want to really ensure that the interpretive strategy and the storytelling is accurate. So there's policies in the neighborhood plan that speaks directly to those kinds of partnerships. And then finally, we have a playful and safe neighborhood and some key features that will really help foster that piece of pride in the Nicomekl River floodplain. Things like a lookout platform to provide prospects and views of the floodplain and wildlife areas. So the plan itself identifies one location for a viewing platform, so close to the Bryden Lagoon area. It's a great place to look at, to have an oversight of all the beautiful wildlife that occurs there. But then there's also an opportunity in the plan, kind of hints at that and signals that, you know, maybe in the future there's an opportunity to actually place a lookout platform, perhaps one in each room. And that would really help entice people to go from one platform to the next. If you can see it out in the distance, it creates that vista and it draws you through the entire corridor. Finally, there's also policies around technology to really enhance the user experience and provide creative opportunities for interpretation of wildlife and history. So we're looking at those ideas around, you know, using QR or geocaching to get people really involved in with their phones or with their technology, to the importance and of the wildlife that exists there and the ecological systems and the history of this really important river course. We also have public art that would be located primarily at trailheads and in other key locations. So there's some policies that speak to that. And finally, also thinking about safety is as a very important component of this, and ensuring that there's safer sight lines throughout the floodplain, and that there's overlook of some of those public spaces. So for that security, that sense of ownership, you know, being able to go through these trails and these paths and feel comfortable and safe, and while doing so, is really, really important and something that we've highlighted through this neighborhood plan. So going from the policy chapters, we'll talk a little bit about the land uses. And like I said, there's a range of different opportunities here to bring a diverse set of housing options and to bring in some gentle small sort of convenience and commercial uses here and there, really to complete the neighborhood and ensure that some of these residential neighborhoods that haven't traditionally had any kind of commercial uses in them prior, that residents can take a little 5-10 minute walk to go to that cafe or to grab, again, that jug of milk at the little convenience store. And so those are really important features in a complete neighborhood, and we'll run through a little bit of that. The first land use feature that I really want to highlight is the floodplain itself. So everything that's in green there is really about protecting the floodplain. It's about enhancing and buffering the floodplain from those residential uses. And it's also about habitat restoration. And so as redevelopment occurs, what we'll actually be doing is increasing some of those setbacks and increasing the width of the floodplain. We've seen some comments and some concerns that perhaps there would be development within the floodplain, but that's not the case at all. We are this neighborhood plan would definitely enshrine the protection of that floodplain and restrict any kind of buildings in the floodplain. The types of features that we might see within the floodplain are really for people to interact with nature. And so features like that pedestrian and cycling bridge, features like maybe little small gazebos to overlook the beautiful sort of river environment. And then also ecological restoration within that floodplain is very important and is featured in the neighborhood plan. That second piece is really about that greater mix of housing. And so what we would see, what we see as really important is sort of right now, a lot of the development that exists there, especially well, on either side of the river, kind of turns its back on the river. And so what we're suggesting through this land use plan, and this is especially the case on the northern edge of the floodplain, is sort of as redevelopment occurs, encouraging and ensuring that development faces that Nicomekl River floodplain so that you have just a much more friendlier interface. And what that might look like is townhouses sort of facing that floodplain. And so you have a really kind of lovely interface between, a certain type of unit and then a bit of a buffer and then the floodplain and really creating that friendly face. So the types of land uses that we're expecting within this area are mid-rise and low-rise type of buildings. And those, the mid-rise buildings would range from around 6 to 12 stories in heights. And then low-rise ranges in around 4 to 6 stories. But there would only be townhomes along the edge of the floodplain. So really looking at that 2 to 3 story height on that northern edge of the floodplain. In terms of townhomes as well, we have, so like I said, north of the Nicomekl River on the outside edge of the floodplain, that's where we would see townhomes, but also in strategic locations just south of the floodplain in some key locations. So you'll see that ground-oriented land use designation in that sort of salmon-colored is where the neighborhood plan sees the importance of including that townhouse type of development and plex type of housing. So it's not just about townhouses, but it's also about duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, and giving that wide variety and flexibility to see different types of housing in that area. There are 2 potential study areas that could also host duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhomes away from some of those frequent bus corridors down 200 Street and 208 Street. And these special study areas would essentially retain their current designation, would retain their zoning as it is today, which is primarily single detached developments, single detached homes. But what we're trying to do here is signal that after the OCP and the Nicomekl neighborhood plan is adopted, that we would then go into another planning process to really dig into with the local residents of this neighborhood in more detail, whether or not this is something that they would like to see. If they would like to have a little bit more diversity of housing within their neighborhood, if they'd like to have the opportunity to perhaps, add a garden suite and build a duplex, or have those kinds of uses within within those areas. And so really any kind of change to that land use designation would be dealt with once the OCP and the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan have been adopted. And again, we're really talking about types of housing forms that today are fairly rare in Langley City. So things like duplexes and triplexes, and in some cases, maybe even townhomes. But again, emphasizing that further analysis and consultation would be required once the neighborhood plan and the OCP are adopted. We also have 3 small scale corner commercial designations that I spoke to a little bit about, that mixed use and complete community policy chapter. So here they are identified on the plan. So like I said, that small sort of food and beverage use at 207th on a property that's owned by the city, currently being used by the Langley Community Services. We have the Portage Park Mixed Use Village, so just north of Portage Park, an opportunity to really redevelop that complex into a really vibrant and dynamic mixed use village. And finally, a convenience corner just at 50th and 200th Street, a small, maybe 2 or 3, commercial retail units there, convenience stores or cafe, that kind of environment where you might be able to go grab a coffee, very pedestrian oriented, very small scale, and integrated into the existing neighborhood. So again, looking at the types of forms that might translate itself into is really the small scale neighborhood sort of style commercial, a place where you might bring your family to have a little lunch on a patio next to the park, for instance. And then finally, in the land use, we're also identifying a few locations where there's trailheads that we would like to see enhanced. And so these enhanced trailheads might include a small concrete pad that could host, say, a food truck and maybe have some small neighborhood events, and really kind of become a space of celebration. So for an afternoon, you might go and grab a snack and then take a nice walk through the floodplain. And again, really thinking about having that inviting and welcoming environment as you enter into this environment, into the floodplain and into the system of trails. So I just want to give a little bit of information around these 2 very important mixed use nodes. The first is the Condor Park Convenience Corner, and that's the one right at the intersection there, 50th and 200th. So the vision there is really for a ground oriented, medium density neighborhood service center with intimate, pedestrian-oriented gathering spaces, and really that strong open space connectivity to Condor Park. So actually in the redevelopment of those lots that are owned by the city, there would actually be an expansion of the Condor Park green space as a component of this convenience corner. And then secondly, for the Portage Park Mixed Use Village, is really thinking about transitioning from the higher density residential uses closer to Langley City's downtown, and establishing, again, a medium density mixed use neighborhood center to complement the existing cultural and recreational amenities that exist at Portage Park, including Michaud House. So thinking about how we might have that lovely sort of little neighborhood mixed use village, a destination in its own right, really, within the floodplain, or adjacent to the floodplain, I should say. in terms of the form and the character of what we're planning here, there's some guidelines related to the public realm, but also related to the development that would occur within the neighborhood. So there's landscape character guidelines. So really ensuring that visual continuity between the floodplain and any kind of development landscaping. So again, that harkens back to my comment around townhomes on the edge of that northern boundary, so that we can have that friendly face, and trying to avoid any kind of tall cedar hedges that sort of fortress a development and kind of backs onto the floodplain. So we'd rather see that visual continuity and have that oversight over those public spaces, and create that real friendly face. Also thinking about landscape designs that emphasize stormwater infrastructure and permeability, so that we're not just sending rainwater directly into the streams and into the water courses, and not creating further erosion problems. In terms of building character, we really want to make sure that any kind of new development, multifamily development, I should say, will be small in mass, will have really great kind of connectivity through the sites. So breaking up some of the larger blocks that exist today. Really orienting the building faces, again, adjacent to the floodplain, and creating that friendly face, and having that active ground floor, so that we have a little bit more visibility and a bit more security in those environments as well. And finally, applying a bit of a river house architectural style that would include, shallow roof pitches, deep overhangs, and some exposed structural elements like wooden beams. So really creating that river house character for development that would happen along that corridor. And that's the gist of the neighborhood plan. I know that's a lot of information to take on, but I'm just going to now stop sharing my screen, and we can move to the Q&A portion of the event.
Thanks so much for that, Patrick. It's a lot of great content, a great overview. I appreciate the sort of framing of the policy discussion, and then getting into the different maps and plans to show how all of those ideas and those themes land in the framework of land uses, and then those specific places within the plan area. So we've got a few questions already flowing into the Q&A pane here, and I think one of them that's been upvoted, sitting at the top of the list, and really even is represented a few different questions, is around development process. I'm wondering, maybe this is something for Carl to speak to more generally, but just to create some clarity for participants around the difference between land use designation, rezoning, and development process, and really effectively how a plan like this lands on the ground, and the steps and timelines basically between imagining the vision and capturing the vision within the neighborhood plan, and then how it ultimately transitions over time through rezoning and ultimately development.
Yeah, thanks, Edward. I can say a few words about that at the outset. Of course, I know there'll be more questions and opportunities to speak to this, but as we talked about last night with the draft OCP open house, both the draft OCP official community plan and the draft Nicomekl plan really are visions for shaping future growth in the city and enhancing the Nicomekl floodplain over the next 30 years. So it's definitely a long-term vision in terms of how land use could shape population growth, new housing, where new jobs can go, where new amenities can go. So it's something that it can be seen almost like a layer on your property. So you have your land use layer, which is in the OCP or the Nicomekl plan. And then underneath that is actually your property and its zoning. So for example, north of the Nicomekl River, in some of our apartment areas, there's actually a lot of properties that here have single family home zoning that's been there for since the 40s or the 50s. But, in the 80s and the 90s, there was a land use, 2000s land use placed on top that allowed for apartment development as part of, shaping that future growth, that land use vision. And what that does is that if the property owner of that, single detached home zone property, when they're looking to sell, and of course, every property owner controls when they can sell their property, when they want to move, that sort of thing, or if they want to stay put. That's your right as being a property owner. But if there comes a day in which you choose to sell or you'd like to rezone your property in that area that I provide as an example, if you apply for rezoning to an apartment building to go up to that land use and rezone your property up, that's something you can apply to council, and council would consider that in making their decision about that rezoning. So if it's consistent with the OCP, that's something that they can look upon favorably. Of course, council ultimately has the authority to make land use decisions based on what they see and what they consider. But I hope that provides some clarity. What we're proposing with the draft OCP and the Nicomekl plan isn't changing zoning. That is definitely not the case. It's really about providing a vision for future land uses. And in the case of these potential study areas, for example, and Patrick mentioned that earlier, is that what we're doing there is because there's been a lengthy process behind and research and background work done that really looked at, well, what are some of the things that we can look at to help shape growth in the future to provide for a livable city, something that protects the Nicomekl floodplain, something that provides more housing options. So, and faced with population decline south of Nicomekl, a few years ago, there was a thought that, well, maybe we look to strategically introduce ground-oriented uses like duplexes, triplexes, townhomes into traditionally single-family areas and look at ways to do that strategically. And, as part of the Nicomekl as well, we also have the issue of the floodplain. And we do have some homes, some of which are in these special or these potential study areas that are actually in the floodplain. And one of the principles of the Nicomekl is to actually build up because you have to be above the flood construction level and away. So one of the ideas there is that over time, again, it's a long-term vision, right? So over time, perhaps as redevelopment occurs, maybe some of these properties end up being duplexes or triplexes or townhomes. So that's part of thinking of it in terms of the study areas. But like Patrick said, if the OCP is adopted with these study areas included, that doesn't change the land use. It doesn't change the zoning. What it does is that at some point in the future, likely the next OCP review, which could be 5-10 years down the road, we would come and approach the neighborhood and say, hey, what are your thoughts now? Is there a desire to look at higher density uses? They could be duplexes, could be, like Patrick said, coach houses, could be townhomes. So that's the purpose of that. And so I hope that explains a little bit about, the differences between land use and zoning. And, at the end of the day, as property owners, you're the ones that determine when you want to move, when you want to sell, and if you want to stay where you are. Thanks.
Thanks, Carl. I don't know. I guess there were a couple of other, just to speak specifically to a couple of places that were noted. I know you've already mentioned this, but one of the specific questions was around 50th Ave and 200 Street and the idea of that commercial corner. And one of the questions specifically was around, would the city have any intent in actually purchasing any of those properties in order to implement something like that? But I assume from your answer that that's not necessarily the case at all, that it really is about a future vision, mapping that direction, shaping potential growth in that direction, and that the market would turn over and you would again move through that rezoning process and ultimate development process as sellers would intend. But I wanted to make sure that specific question was voiced.
Yeah, thanks, Edward. And in that location, there's a collection of both private properties and city-owned properties. And as is in the case in other parts of the city, where there's a future land use, if that land use gets adopted with the Nicomekl plan and the OCP, at some point in the future, if someone is looking to purchase properties and assemble them together in order to, create the parcels or areas that would be, something following what we have in the neighborhood plan. For example, we're, suggesting that property parcels should be of an acre in size, so that as redevelopment occurs, it's something that the neighborhood can sort of anticipate what's coming. It helps with certainty, and it also helps to show that what the potential development in that area is pretty small scale as well when you compare it to places like in Willoughby, where townhouse complexes can be 8 acres at a time. So and it's something that occurs. It's not like once the OCP is adopted that the next day suddenly development's going to occur. These things do take time, and that's why OCPs and neighborhood plans have such long time frames. But what it also does, though, is it provides some certainty for residents, for landowners, and people that are coming into the city as the city grows about what could happen in those areas. So it really is a little bit of an organic process when you have a land use and people choose to sell their properties to people that are seeking to buy properties and assemble them for future redevelopment.
Excellent. Staying with this same theme and with you still in the hot seat, I have one last question, I think, which is a follow-up to this. And it's around the real sensitive issue of speculation and the values that are created potentially on paper when you move through a designation like this. So I know that we are, in looking at some of the planning work and thinking about some of those neighborhoods, even ones that are currently zoned for ground-oriented or even mid-rise, up to mid-rise, low-rise and mid-rise apartment forms. There is some question around redevelopment pressures and speculation that's attached to that. So I wonder if you could speak to maybe some of the consideration.
Yes, thank you. I think that, again, going back, what an OCP helps to do with the land uses is to provide some certainty about what future redevelopment possibilities could be. Again, if property owners choose to either move or sell or either redevelop the properties themselves, they have an idea of what the possibility is and what council would consider. And, we want to be very careful when we're planning for the future as well. You don't want to, it is a 30-year vision. And of course, where we're looking north of the river around SkyTrain, the downtown, those land uses and densities, especially in the downtown area, have actually been there for 20 years. And it does take time for redevelopment to occur. And when the market is there, for example, when SkyTrain arrives, then you're probably going to see more redevelopment. South of the river, we want to be very careful that we're not destabilizing neighborhoods and causing speculation by just throwing land uses around in areas where they shouldn't be. And that's why the ground-oriented land uses, we're being very careful to align those along the major arterial streets like 200th and 208th. And there's also a pocket along 203 where the city recently did some major multimodal upgrades and provides a good connection to the north part of the city and also Great Crescent. And there's also a good access there as well. But, I think getting to the heart of the issue, like in these potential study areas too, and we've had some residents ask us about that and the concern about speculation. And, I think that, if there is a study area and someone approaches the city and says, hey, would you be willing to do a rezoning or take in a rezoning, we wouldn't support it because it's not in the OCP. The only thing those study areas do is again, send a signal that at some point in the future, again, it could be 5 years down the road, where, we may specifically ask those residents, those landowners, Do you want to consider different land use other than single attached homes? Maybe it's duplexes, could be townhouses. And you know what? Those residents may say no at that time as well. And that's perfectly fine. We've got some great feedback during these draft plans. And that's what we're doing tonight and through the survey is that we went through a process to come up with these land use concepts and proposed areas. And we're taking feedback from the public, especially tonight. And we're very happy to have everyone here tonight. We appreciate your feedback. And all that's going to be considered in terms of how we might potentially update the plans before they go to council for consideration. So maybe a little bit of a lengthy answer for you, Edward, but I know there's a lot of people listening. And I think, sometimes you got to be a little bit more detailed in the answer when it comes to people's homes and properties. They obviously have a right to know. Again, we're trying to build a vision for the future. But at the same time, we want to be very careful, strategic, and sensitive as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carl. That's really helpful. And I appreciate you taking a little bit extra time, keeping you in the hot seat there. There were, it was a question sitting at the top of the list with lots of upvotes. So I think you covered off a lot of the questions in a number of questions that had been voiced. So that's really helpful. There's another one, and it does build a bit on some of the issues that you touched on, but I want to direct this one maybe to Patrick to speak to. And it really has to do more with form and character and, concerns that are voiced around this idea of introducing townhome forms or other plex forms south of the river in these strategic locations along transit corridors. For those reasons, they're understood, but there still is a concern around the scale of that development, the type of that development. And I just want to ask you to maybe comment on, how you see that integration or how you see that as potentially supporting or fitting in, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key components of our rationale for including some townhouse development, some plex housing type of land uses in some of these neighborhoods is about that alignment. And Carl spoke a little bit to this. It's alignment with transportation options. And it's also about providing that diversity of housing options. So understanding that that many of the single detached homes that exist today are also becoming more and more out of reach in terms of affordability for a large majority of Langley City residents. But in terms of form and character, what we can do and what we have done through the multifamily development permit guidelines is really ensure that any kind of new multifamily development, whether it's a townhouse or whether it's an apartment building, that it is scaled right with its neighborhood, that there's neighborhood friendly sort of form and massing. So that means, stepping down to really get to that same height as what the neighboring property might be, ensuring that we're being very considerate of the surroundings and ensuring that, the materials and the building forms are really representative of the surrounding environment, whether it's a single detached form or if it's another sort of townhouse type of development or duplex form. Many will know that there are already some townhouses that exist south of the Nicomekl there, and it really is about finding that that right type of development for some of these areas. So like Carl said, we're here, we're listening to some of the feedback and certainly open to refining the draft plan and ensuring that this is representative of community values and desires out in the neighborhoods.
That's great. This is a bit of a technical follow-up, but there's a question that's related to the size of what we're talking about relative to existing single family lots, and specifically around these plexes. Would that be something, and this gets into zoning level detail, but would this be something that we would imagine on a single lot where you would start to see forms that effectively represent as a traditional single family home, but they may have 3 units within the structure? Or are you imagining that these would all sort of require multiple lot consolidation and rebuilds?
Mhm. Well, I think that's the beauty of the land use designation, is that it allows a little bit of flexibility there. So in some cases, it might be a single detached home that looks exactly like a neighbor's single detached home, but it happens to have 3 units within it, right? It might have a basement suite, and it might have a top floor suite. That would be an example of a triplex. Duplexes can also look very similar and be quite well integrated into the shape and the form of neighboring properties. So there is that option within that ground-oriented land use designation to do those types of forms. And then also there is the option, and it would also probably occur where there would be, maybe 2 or 3 properties that are purchased at the same time to have a small townhouse development, for instance. And so there is a bit of flexibility within that ground-oriented land use designation to do a little bit of both, and that really gets to the diversity that we're trying to explore through these neighborhood plans and trying to create.
Yeah, and that's great, Patrick. It's that's something that as part of once the OCP is adopted, we'll see what land uses and areas are included in the final plan. Of course, we're also updating our zoning bylaw, and we want to make sure that there's that flexibility so that in areas that are ground oriented, where maybe there's a lot or two that's backing onto the floodplain, and because it's in or very close to the floodplain, the construction level actually has to come up and away from the floodplain because of environmental considerations. And that might be an option for someone to look at doing a duplex or a triplex, like you said, that has a very similar character to a single family home. You see some of those in other cities where you have a house with multiple units in it, but from the outside, it looks like a house. And there's also that variation too that, say on 200 Street, where you have properties that are directly fronting onto 200 Street, which is a very busy street, and they have their driveways fronting onto 200 Street, which is a little bit difficult to get in and out. The possibility there for 3, 4, 5 properties being assembled, and the developer would be required to put in a lane in the back that would provide access to those townhomes. And those lots are also rather deep, so you'd be able to get driveway areas and parking areas to handle the parking that would be required with those townhomes. So there's a variety of options there in that land use, and it also sets up an incremental growth over time. We're not talking about 5, 6, 7 acres being redeveloped at a time, like we see to the north of us there. This is meant to be strategic, incremental, and sensitive, and provide those options over time.
Great. Thank you both. Switching gears a little bit from that discussion around housing forms and I want to skip back over to more of the parks conversation and really what is central to the neighborhood plan, and that is the river and the relationship of some of these trail networks and really park improvements to the river and the experience of the neighborhood plan. So specifically, there are a few questions around location of trails, types of trails, feasibility related to that. And I just wanted to ask maybe more of a general question related to planning process again, around where we are with the neighborhood plan and what this might look like as we take some of these ideas around primary all-season path alignments or trail loops and locations, and how that might start to get refined. Patrick.
I mean, it's always a difficult challenge to identify the exact route of a new trail or a path within an existing floodplain. And I noticed that there is a question specifically about, a trail or a path on the south side of the Nicomekl from 200 and 208. And part of the consideration in the identification of locations for trails and paths has a lot to do with well, one, the ecological sensitivity of the floodplain in certain areas. So in the neighborhood plan, there's a really great map in the ecologically sensitive policy chapter that starts to identify those places with high sensitivity value, the places with moderately high sensitivity value, and so those have to be considered as well when we're thinking about new paths. In terms of the all-season path, and the reason for its location on the north side there is because by identifying some of those low-rise land uses where redevelopment might occur, it allows us to, gain a little bit of space between the floodplain and the new development as it occurs, so that we're not we're not encroaching into these environmentally sensitive areas. We're really trying to focus in areas where there is an opportunity through redevelopment to gain a little bit more space in that from the floodplain, buffer it with the all-season path. So two considerations: it's really about redevelopment potential and whether or not we can gain a little bit more of that buffer, and really looking at the ecological sensitivity of the floodplain and making sure that we're not impacting that too strongly through new kinds of infrastructure and paths.
That's great. And maybe Carl, just from the city's process side, would you see this plan setting forth then a park plan? Like, would you, I'm sure there is, there's this interplay between potential development areas where you would see improvements that would be potentially publicly accessible, privately owned and maintained open space, where you might have improvements, or you may have those paying for improvements within the public realm, within the parks, designated park areas. But would there be a plan really as almost a city park plan for the Nicomekl River that would be provided as a next step, or what's your thinking there?
Yes, thanks, Edward. So in the draft OCP, we actually have, once it's adopted, there's a section implementation where it talks about future plans. And one of them would be to update the city's park, recreation and culture master plan to help to align what's in our parks master plan now with what's in the OCP and the Nicomekl to guide improvements. And, just scrolling through the questions here as well, it's something that we want to have up front in terms of when we're talking about the park improvements and that sort of thing. We really want to strive to have development fund those park improvements. You can't have density without amenities. And that's one of the key things about both the draft OCP and the Nicomekl plan is that through land use change, again, 90% of it is slated to occur north of the Nicomekl. We have, a community amenity contribution system. We're looking at density bonusing. Individual development applications can also fund improvements. For example, a new bridge over the Baldy Creek on the Michaud Trail is being funded by new apartment buildings in that area. So those are the sort of things that are negotiated so that the taxpayer isn't paying for these park improvements. They're being paid for by new investments, community, new development. And that's absolutely critical. And I think one of the neat things about the Nicomekl plan is that, the residents that are living in the area, there's going to be a key focus on improving the Nicomekl floodplain, the trails, and enhancing its ecological integrity as well. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. There was one other specific question around trail alignments and loops and the potential to create loops along the south side. I think just to highlight back to Patrick, you sort of alluded to that in the idea that there are some constraints to those considerations based on sensitivity, but I think from an overall recreational strategy perspective, that there's very much the intent to create loops options and different lengths of pathways so that people have a choice and that they don't have to retrace steps to get home and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there is also some existing trails and paths that we have to take into consideration. We don't want to also duplicate what already exists in many locations. And so it really is about looking at where some of those pieces of infrastructure are missing today, where those trails and paths aren't located, and where there could really, where it could make a big impact on connectivity. And so I think those are really important considerations when we were looking at those addition of new paths.
That's great. So I'm going to ask one more question around the park's end, and then I'm going to flip it over and ask a little bit more about phasing and timing, as that's another question and a theme that I think we can touch on. The last question is an interesting one around really city budgets and expenditures related to park improvements. And the question is really in light of COVID-related debt. And just the sort of cost of business today in relative to COVID, why would we be spending? Why would the city be considering spending this money on outdoor open space improvements, paths, platforms, public art, etc.?
Mhm. Yeah, so there's two main components perhaps to answer that question. Firstly, is the neighborhood plan gives policy direction to look at community amenity contributions as a way to fund a lot of these enhancements. So not looking at capital projects, not looking at necessarily using taxpayer funds to fund these big infrastructure or these types of floodplain projects, really about ensuring that we're using development as redevelopment occurs, and ensuring that it's development that's paying for those types of amenities and those types of features in the floodplain. So I think, for one, that's a really positive aspect of this neighborhood plan. And secondly, I think what we've noticed through COVID is that many folks who don't have great access to green spaces, really want that high quality, usable, natural environment nearby. And they want to be able to have that access, because it's so important to be able to get out of one's apartment unit or townhouse and interact with nature and get a breath of fresh air, especially in an environment where we find ourselves today, in a pandemic where one of the few things that I've been doing is actually just going for walks around my neighborhood. So I'd hope that what we learn from this pandemic is that high quality landscapes and natural environments that are accessible to a diverse group of people is really key and important to improve our mental health and make sure that we're healthy. So that's I think a main consideration there.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick.
And I think, Patrick, like you noted at the start, and I think everyone knows here in this open house that the Nicomekl is an absolute jewel and great green space that is within a 5-minute walk of almost everyone in the residential areas of the city. And that ease of access to green space is hard to duplicate in other cities. And it's something that, again, we want to ensure that we're looking at improvements. And that's something that we want to look at funding from contributions from development. Development, again, can't happen without contributions to amenities in the community, improvements in the Nicomekl, for example, and other areas. And Edward, if I may, I just noticed that there was a couple other quick questions about land use north of the river. I think there was some comments about the viability of apartments and that sort of thing, I believe, around 53 Avenue. And that's something that we, as part of the consultation, we take a look at what's possible there, part of our analysis, and also what's happened. There are some apartments that were constructed, I believe, back in the 70s and the 80s, closer to where the senior center is, that are close to the floodplain. So there is precedent for having apartment buildings there. But the key thing about the Nicomekl plan is stepping down the development as you get closer to the river. And like Patrick said, having those ground-oriented uses that address the river, the pathways, and having that nice interface with the floodplain, the park space. Something similar you'd see in some of these, highly regarded neighborhoods like Osprey Landing, where you have townhouses, up against, the green space there along the Fraser River. And hopefully people, no kids will be throwing rocks into neighborhoods or into the yards and that sort of thing. So I did see that comment there. And of course, as part of our design guidelines, there would be appropriate fencing and that sort of thing to maintain privacy, but to also ensure that there's clear sight lines so that people also aren't going to do that, because if they can't see where they're throwing it, sometimes they don't care, right? And if you can see them throwing it, you can also tell them to stop. And report it to the city, and we'll send our bylaw officers down there. But lastly, on the study area, or the potential study area in the Blacklock area, the thought there again, we're not proposing change now, but some of those properties that are on the north side, I believe of 51, is it 51A? They're actually within the floodplain. And one of the considerations there is that if there's ever future redevelopment there, those buildings will have to be elevated above the flood construction level. And, at some point in the future, when there's a desire by property owners maybe to redevelop or, sell to someone that wants to redevelop, having that study area there enables for future consultation with those residents to say, does it make sense to have maybe duplexes, triplexes, townhomes in that area at some point in the future? So thanks for the opportunity to comment on that.
Great, thank you, Carl, and thanks for addressing those other points that were noted in the other questions. Switching gears just a little bit, and we may come back to some of that, but there was a question around phasing. And generally understanding, the neighborhood plan and the OCP both as long-term visions for growth and growth management. Is there a sense within these plans of how development phasing would occur, or what are the forces that start to help manage that as well? Maybe I would offer that to Patrick first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is very market driven, right? So we can't say which development might occur first. Unfortunately, it really does come forth with when a developer comes forward with an application. And so what we do know is that redevelopment is a fairly complex task. And so, if a developer has to, say, perhaps buy up 3 properties to build a townhouse development, well, it's going to take time to purchase those 3 properties and then to submit an application to the city. And so it really, there's no real phasing here in terms of when development's going to happen. But what there is a vision for the next 10, 20 years. And there's no guarantee that even within those 10, 20 years that this is going to be built out. It does depend on the economic forces of the day. And we find ourselves in a pandemic right now, but we still need to plan for the future. So there's a lot of factors that play into that. So yeah, there is no easy answer for the phasing and when this might happen. It really depends on when people decide to sell their property and whether the person who purchases that property would like to rezone, or if the person who owns the property would like to rezone. It really is a bit of an incremental kind of piece by piece type of thing. So we can't say that one particular pocket might develop before another, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. Carl, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and I think that, Patrick, you summarized it well. Again, OCP, neighborhood plans, those are again, a vision for shaping growth, making investments in new amenities and that sort of thing over a 10, 20, 30-year period. What I could say is that, north of the river, especially around, the SkyTrain stations and the downtown and some of the growth areas, around 200th and that sort of thing, north of 53. That's where the big stuff is happening and will happen, especially around the stations where you have larger properties redeveloped, and the scale and the pace of development, may seem a little bit quicker or more widespread because the properties are larger. South of Nicomekl, again, this is also part of the thinking behind, proposing these land uses, is that it'll be much more incremental, small scale. Like Patrick said, it'll be, 3, 4, 5 properties at a time, assembled, go through the process, that sort of thing. And, it's not like, large area, 5, 6, 7 acres, that's going to be rezoned all at once and suddenly pops up, 80 townhomes overnight or in the course of 6 months, or however long it takes to construct. So, south of the river, again, it's a lot more strategic and will probably be a little bit more incremental over time. For example, along 200th and 208, you might start seeing, small townhome developments or plex developments coming up as they build those lanes and then connecting those all together. And you might see a block face, turn over into townhomes or row homes and that sort of thing over the course of 10 to 15 years.
Right, great. I mean, I think it is interesting, like as someone who previously lived in a 9-unit townhouse that was the site of a 2-lot consolidation, a corner lot and an internal lot. And then recognizing that that building sat very comfortably on a series of single family homes. You're dealing with, that idea of gentle infill and kind of the form of even something that would hold 9 units on a consolidated lot scenario next to a 3-story or 2.5-story single detached home was not an uncomfortable relationship in that specific context. In the Q&A, there is some concern, around, or I would say significant concern voiced around scale and character. And so I think it is something that that we're hearing and that we obviously have to be very careful with as the plan goes forward in speaking to that, which I appreciate you guys have already spoken to in some length here. But this idea of, well, why not basically retain the character of the single family neighborhoods? Why not look to carriage homes as an alternate to accommodate some of that gentle infill and density? What are the heights that we would ultimately see? And I think that all of those things really point to whether it's zoning or policy direction around that sensitivity. You're looking at 3-story heights so that you are in that 2.5 to 3-story height connecting to a single family form. You're not looking at buildings that are larger than a typical large lot single detached home that you see south of the river now. There's nothing that really precludes a carriage home unless the lot configuration itself doesn't allow for it. So, I mean, I think all of those strategies are being considered and are very much a part of the thinking in how do we allow for these gentle ways of accommodating a greater diversity of housing types within an area that we are hearing is sensitive in terms of its character and the sense that the neighborhood has in terms of its own identity and that character. So I think this is all, we're seeing a lot of that voiced here, and I think there's been a good conversation around that sensitivity as it relates to the plan and ultimately the zoning that would control that. There's another question that came in, this back on the issue of park design and really kind of thinking at this larger scale beyond the neighborhood plan itself, but looking at wildlife connectivity and habitat connectivity beyond Langley City, and really looking at the Langley Township, and even towards the US border, and looking at these larger opportunities to connect. Has that been a part of the conversation?
Absolutely. So what's really great is that Metro Vancouver is currently working on a new sort of greenways and active transportation network across the various communities, and so that is absolutely something that we've been communicating with them to ensure that our plans for the Nicomekl River floodplain integrates well with our neighbors, and in many respects, what happens as well is through the referral process for the adoption of this official community plan and the Nicomekl River District Neighborhood Plan, is we'll be referring these as well to our neighbors in the township of Langley and at the city of Surrey. So there definitely is that conversation that's ongoing, and so it's both with the communities and also with the regional government at Metro Vancouver.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Another question that popped up here that folks had questions around was the detail around an all-season path. Just acknowledging floodwaters and areas that are underwater. How that ties into the consideration of what is an all-season path, and where does that live?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the reason why we decided to locate the all-season path really on the northern outside edge of the floodplain. So that path would actually take place as redevelopment occurs in an area that's at a high enough elevation where flooding wouldn't impact it, most of the time. Obviously, if there's a big flooding event, we can't prevent flooding of an all-season path, but the idea would be that most years that this path would be free from any kind of flooding, and so it would occur again at an elevation deep or on the outside edge of the floodplain at an elevation where that flooding wouldn't occur, or in some places maybe it is a little bit elevated, perhaps it has a little bit of a floating dock type of situation in one place, but really the idea here is to keep it on the edge of the floodplain at an elevation where that wouldn't have too much of an impact at all. Because many of the trails and paths, and I'll just note, many of the trails and paths actually kind of weave their way through the floodplain right now. So this all-season path would be quite different from those. It would be really kind of on the outskirts of the floodplain.
Great. I'm going to shift this one. This is an interesting segue from the conversation around park improvements. You start to think about the all-season path, the improvements within the river corridor itself, and really the increased use of the park system itself, and then parking associated with destination parks and this amenity now. So I'm wondering, how parking has been considered within the context of the growth strategy, and if you could speak maybe to that issue around parks improvements, destinations, how you accommodate that, as well as then the densification that's occurring along those edges as a result of that amenity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key components that we're looking at here is in some of these enhanced trailheads and in some of these regular trailheads is there's an opportunity to ensure that in terms of accessibility of those trail paths, those trails and paths, that there is a little bit of parking that's provided, especially for folks who might be seniors or might have a mobility challenge. We want to ensure that, again, folks who aren't necessarily living right next door to the floodplain have the opportunity to also access it and to drive out to this park space and really experience this beautiful jewel at the center of the city. In terms of parking at sort of a higher level, at the official community plan level, what we're looking at is in the sort of northern part of the city, closer to the SkyTrain stations, are some parking reductions, but primarily related to that SkyTrain station, right? And making sure that the types of development that get built around the SkyTrain stations are representative of the types of people who are going to be using that SkyTrain that SkyTrain investment. So we want to make sure that we're encouraging people to use transit rather than providing a whole whack of parking. That today we actually know that through a Metro Vancouver parking study, there is an oversupply of parking in many multifamily developments these days. So we are exploring some reduction in parking in multifamily developments north of the river. But when we're talking about some of these duplexes and ground-oriented forms, and also when we're talking about things like garden suites and secondary suites, we're also ensuring that there's direction in the official community plan that speaks directly to, needing to have in the zoning bylaw the ability to park a car per unit at the very least on site, so that we're not clogging roads with parking, and also that there is enough of a frontage to that property, so that if there is someone who is parking on the road, that it can happen right in front of that property.
Yeah, Patrick, thanks for that. We talked about this at last night's open house as well, and yeah, like you said, around SkyTrain, we're seeing that the demand for parking spaces is declining, not only because of the ease of getting onto transit, but car ownership, amongst people that tend to live in apartments is declining, and there's some apartment buildings that have a lot of empty spaces, and it's not an efficient use of land or resources and that sort of thing. That being said, south of the river and along the river in the more low density residential areas away from SkyTrain, we are being very careful. We want to ensure that these land uses are adequately parked. So any kind of duplex, triplex, townhomes, they need to have the appropriate parking on site so people are able to park on those lots, not on the streets. We know that people sometimes use their garages for a little bit of storage. Maybe I'm understating that, but we want to make sure that these new developments are parked adequately. And I noticed in the Q&A in the chat, there were some questions about, what about coach houses? As part of the new OCP, the area between 200th, 208th, and north of Grade, we have an urban residential land use designation that Patrick touched on there, where if your lot is big enough and wide enough, you have the opportunity to have a single family home, a secondary suite within that home, and a coach house in the backyard. But you'll have to provide 4 parking spaces on your property to make sure that that additional unit isn't putting additional pressure on those streets and those neighborhoods. And it's safe to say that we do understand parking difficulties and pressures in those neighborhoods, and we're taking it very seriously.
Thank you, Carl.
I was gonna suggest, if I may, I noticed there was a few questions about one of the neat aspects of the recreational part of the plan, the lookout towers. I wonder if we could maybe provide a little bit of detail on that.
Absolutely. There was a question regarding sort of the location and the number. Patrick, did you want to speak to that?
Sure. So the plan itself identifies a location for one lookout platform near the Bryden Lagoon, sort of at that the Baldy Creek Trail, or the Rotary floodplain trail there. And so there's only one that's identified in terms of a location, and we would like to use it as sort of a test for how people react to it, and if it's an enjoyable piece the floodplain experience if it's really well used, and if people are experiencing wildlife in this new kind of function. And so essentially that's the only one that's really planned in the neighborhood plan, but we did include some policy that sort of starts to signal it's saying, maybe if it does work out, there's an opportunity to also include one, not just in the garden wild, but also maybe in some of these other 3 rooms, so that you have that sort of continuity across each one, and you kind of are drawn from one to the next, and you have a little destination within each room. So really, we want to make sure that these lookout platforms are not at a height that would create any kind of privacy issues. So we're thinking about something that's still relatively low, but really provides that overlook over that beautiful natural asset of the Nicomekl River, right? So I think this would be a really great piece of a new feature within the floodplain, and we heard from some of our environmental stakeholders also saying that that would be a really great component of the floodplain, because it's low impact. It doesn't have that same it doesn't have a very strong impact on the natural environment, on the ecology, and on the habitat that exists in those areas, because it's elevated a little bit. So yeah, there was and it was also one of the most popular sort of items when we were at the open house. So these are some of the reasons why we've included it. One in the neighborhood plan, but really kind of signaling that there's an opportunity if the community desires afterwards to look at a few more.
That's great. There was one comment around just really welcoming improvements and activity within the river corridor and the trail network, somewhat related to safety concerns and currently their experience of walking those areas, and the idea of more of that activity within the space would make for sort of a better experience. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on that concern and how that was addressed through the planning discussion around safety and ideas there, as well as then kind of managing potential conflict within that space. I'm thinking more specifically around pedestrians and cyclists as you start to encourage use within the space. Is there a sense that the trails would be scaled to be larger, or has that gone into the thinking towards the park planning side?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, safety and security were very common themes in the early stages of this process. We've heard from a lot of community residents who said, that there's safety issues in the floodplain, and they don't sometimes feel safe walking through the trails or the paths in there. And so we really took that to heart, and we want to also note that the official community plan and a neighborhood plan like this Nicomekl River District one are primarily about land use, development, and design. So we can only address safety through that lens in these plans. And so what we've done is we've included development permit guidelines that really speak strongly to things like overlook and public ownership or ownership of these lands. So you can perhaps have a bit of, it's part of the reason why we want some of those townhomes along the edge of that northern floodplain, right? So that you have a direct view from your unit onto, say, the all seasons path, for example, right? So that interaction between somebody's private property and that all season path is one where there's clear sight lines. It's one where there's public, or there's overview over that path, so people feel more comfortable walking down that path. There's no, it's trying to avoid this kind of fortressing of development, right? Where you have these very tall cedar hedges that essentially block any kind of visibility. And so that's one aspect is through, presenting a bit of a friendlier face of development onto the floodplain. And the second strategy is through some of these enhancements of the trailheads, right? So maybe opening those up a little bit, adding a little bit of lighting here and there, having some wayfinding as well, so people understand where the trail system is going and they're not getting lost in the trail system, and incorporating those little wayfinding features, not just at the trailheads, but at certain points throughout the trail system as well. Those are all design features that we can do to enhance safety in the floodplain. And when we start talking about we're also cognizant that there are homeless people who are using the floodplain as well for shelter, and we want to that discussion itself it kind of gets brought up to a much higher level around housing, not just at the municipal scale, but also at a provincial and federal scale, about being able to provide the type of below market housing in our communities that is adequate for the population that exists there and resides here today. And that's not something that the city of Langley is going to be able to do on its own. It really does require a lot of investment and a lot of participation from other senior levels of government.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. I wanted to check in on time. We're coming right to the top of the hour. And I just wanted to check in terms of time that we have allocated here versus I know we wanted to wrap up and speak to timeline and next steps.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to go over a few slides just to give a little bit more, just to give a bit of a conclusion to this meeting. So I'm just going to share my screen once again.
Great. And just to say thank you to everyone for their input into the Q&A panel. If there are additional questions and comments that you wanted to provide beyond what we've discussed this evening, Patrick, you can speak to that as well in providing that direction.
Absolutely. So just to start us off here, again, I want to reiterate what Edward just said and thank everyone for participating. Your input is super valuable to this process. And, throughout the entire project, we've been listening to what residents have been saying. We've been adapting and changing the ideas and the concept and the plan itself to reflect that input and to reflect that feedback. So I just wanted to note that this is not the last time that we get to do this. So there's this is the open house, but we now have the opportunity to refine the plan based on the feedback that you've provided us tonight. And then we present it to council, and that's going to go through a bylaw adoption process, which essentially also includes a public hearing. So there's another opportunity, even once we've refined the plan, to voice your opinions and to voice your comments and thoughts on the plan and its implementation. Also, we want to encourage everyone to go and take the online survey that's available online right now. You may have already done so, but we're encouraging everyone to talk to their families, their friends, and ensure that as many people as possible are getting involved in the discussion. So you can visit langleycity.ca to find the survey. It's available there, and you can comment on both the official community plan and the Nicomekl River District neighborhood plan. And that's all I have today. But what I want to do is, because we didn't get to every single question, and what we can do is we can actually link the question to your email address. And I think we mentioned this last night, that we will take note of the questions that you've left in the Q&A. And we will be contacting you folks with answers to your questions. And also note that if you do have any questions that you didn't get a chance to put in the Q&A, we're also welcoming further comments and questions directly by email at devservices@langleycity.ca. So I think the email address has been put in the chat there. So feel free to also send emails and comments to that email address, and we'll respond as best we can. Carl or Francis, did you have any final thoughts or comments before we finish the session here?
I'll leave it for Carl, same as last night.
Yes, thank you. I just want to extend a heartfelt thanks to everyone that attended tonight and provided their input. It's very valuable to us. We appreciate it. And like Patrick said, we're going to take all the feedback we received and take a look at it and use it to formulate our recommendations to council. And so thank you once again. We really appreciate your time and input.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just for the panelists here, I can set up a quick Zoom meeting if we'd like a debrief. Yeah. Okay. So I'll send an email